Hey buddy, watch this.
Yeah, that's right. It's time to talk about more custom cards, and I'm happy to say this time we have some from a lot of new creators, some new names in the video today, but we're taking a look at League of Legends or maybe Teamfight Tactics characters, depending on your interest. And we got some super cool cards, so let's jump into it. Up first here is Jinx the Loose Cannon from Silverwind, a 2-mana 3/2 rogue minion that reads, after your hero equips a new weapon, it may attack again. And then this crazy battle cry, replace your hand with random weapons. So this card is totally absurd, right? If you play it on turn 2, you're probably not getting a whole lot of value because you're just dumping a ton of weapons into your hand that are going to get stuck, and it's going to be really hard to play them all because Jinx has to be alive for her effect to matter. It's not a for the rest of the game style effect, and she's not going to stay alive when you just play her down on turn 2. So as far as like a tempo play, I don't really think this is going to do much because having a ton of weapons in your hand that early in the game is a huge liability. But she gets more interesting, say, starting on like turn 4, for instance. On turn 4, if you have a weapon equipped already, you can attack, you can play Jinx, and you can maybe hit your hero power and get to attack again for an extra ping. Then she gets really, really exciting when you have something like 10 mana. Because suddenly you can play Jinx and you have 8 mana remaining and this giant handful of weapons, and you can theoretically play 8 mana worth of weapons and get a ton of damage output. Now, keep in mind that you're capped by mana. You have to spend mana on each of these weapons, so it's not like it's an infinite damage combo. But you could, say, play like, an Arcanite Reaper and a Fiery War Axe for 8 damage worth of bursts. So turning Jinx into, like, this kind of funny little pyro blast that leaves even more weapons in your hand. But again, this is probably a one-turn style effect. It's not something that's going to last forever because as soon as Jinx dies, you're again just stuck with a bunch of weapons. So you really have to maximize your chances to make this one work. And beyond that, remember that if you do get all these weapons in hand and you're overriding them, you're not really getting the full value of the weapon because usually you're going to be wasting some of that durability. So this is kind of an all-in style of play, but it seems like a super fun one and could create some pretty crazy scenarios. Maybe you have to push through a taunt minion with the first bit, then you do some face damage. Maybe you just chip away at multiple minions like a Soul Threes style effect, for instance. But Jinx creates those cool opportunities, and I think some really fun turns would come of this. Perhaps some scary burst damage, but nothing worse than like Pyroblast. And despite the power of this effect, there's a lot of downside too, because having that many weapons is a real problem as soon as Jinx dies. So I think this is a card that is fun in a lot of different ways. Moving on here to Zoe, Aspect of Twilight from Golden Rafam. She's a 4-mana 2/5 for Mage, and she's a little bit, I guess, like an Archmage Vargoth and a Lorewalker Cho had a baby. Because she reads, after your opponent casts a spell, cast a copy of it with targets chosen randomly. So instead of like Lorewalker Cho adding the spell to your hand, Zoe's just going to go ahead and create some chaos and cast it for you right away. So if your opponent plays a Frostbolt on Zoe, for instance, Zoe might Frostbolt herself and kill herself, or she might Frostbolt one of your opponent's minions or your opponent's face for lethal damage, right? If your opponent plays a Pyroblast, well, who knows what's going to happen next, right? If your opponent plays like a Flame Strike, they're going to really regret it because the Flame Strike will work where it's only enemy minions, so they might wipe out their own board accidentally, for instance. So a handful of different scenarios here that create a lot of decision points for your opponent. It's like, do I take a risk? Like, do I Frostbolt this and hope for the best? Like, do I play a play that's safe? Maybe I don't play any spells at all. And I like that Zoe creates those scenarios where suddenly everybody has to start thinking about all the downsides, all the chances here. Is she a little RNG based? Sure. But is that fun in Hearthstone? Usually, and I don't think this is particularly bad RNG because people do still have control over it to some extent. They can decide not to play the spell or only play safe spells. Or kill Zoe right off the bat, right? If they just kill her, it's no problem at all. So your opponent still has decision points, still has influence over what's going to happen. So I think this card would just be a bundle of fun. Taking Lorewalker Cho from meme status, perhaps to actually even some competitive level of viability. Up next is Kha'zix from Amaltheos. A 5-mana 4/4, again for Rogue. This time Battlecry, if your opponent controls only one minion, destroy it and gain stealth. So we have here Kha'zix, character who likes to isolate enemies and destroy them with tons of damage, in this case just killing them outright before going back into stealth as the assassin that he is. And I think this is a perfect effect for Rogue. It's exactly what Rogue is all about, right? Isolating and assassinating, that's the fantasy for Rogue to a T, so this card is a wonderful fit for it. Now, from a power level standpoint, clearly this can be pretty strong, right? It's a Vile Spine Slayer in a lot of ways, but that doesn't require combo. It has a different condition instead, which is that your opponent has a single minion. Now, in some boards, that's going to be really tough if they go wide and you need to kill one particular big threat. You're going to feel a little bit dumb with a Kha'zix, but in most cases, Rogue can chip away at other minions. You know, they can backstab one, they can Vendetta another, isolate the big scary thing, and then Kha'zix comes along and he cleans it up. So I do think this card has a lot of playability as that big tempo swing style card, particularly in certain metas, you know, Mountain Giant on 4, Kha'zix on 5, yippee, right? Those are the sorts of things that could feel great with something like this. So it takes Assassinate and it puts it on a body, puts it on a stick, as some people say, but in a way that's still not universally better than Assassinate because it does have some conditionality to it. And to me, that's a great design and a really good fit for the character too. Up next here is Amumu the Sad Mummy from Raffle Moffle, and a really good fit for Saviors of Uldum. Clearly, 4-mana 2/1 with Reborn, Rush, and Death Rattle freeze all characters. So there's a lot going on with this card that we need to break down. So primary use case here is probably, right, you play Amumu, you need to freeze the opponent's board, so he has Rush, that's great. You trade him into something, and he freezes all characters. Then he actually comes back as another 2/1 with Rush because of that Reborn aspect, which means you could theoretically trade him in again if you wanted to, say, like, deal 2 damage to a minion. That would be cool. Pretty powerful play. Deal 4, freeze the board. Significantly better than something like Frost Nova. Or you could try to leave him on board and create a sneaky scenario where if your opponent somehow can't kill the 1 health Reborn Amumu, then you might get to do it all over again next turn. And that could be incredibly powerful, locking down their board twice. But it's a very susceptible, risky sort of play. You could do another scenario where you actually just play the Amumu and maybe don't trade. And then your opponent's got this really weird scenario where they're like, well, gosh, what do I do now? Even if they don't have anything on board, it's like another high friction play. It's almost like a Doomsayer in a way where you're kind of like, man, what do I do? I got to play minions into this, but I can't deal with it. I know my board's going to get locked down. And again, high friction plays like that, I think, are really rewarding for both players because they have decisions to make, strategy to implement, and that's good for the game. When there's healthy strategic decisions being made, I think that's really cool. And at the end of the day, this is a powerful effect, but it's not that crazy, right? Because if your opponent can just kill the Reborn Amumu, it's going to freeze again, which doesn't do anything. Stacking that double freeze doesn't mean they're locked out for 2 turns. So it's kind of just like they did a Frost Nova with 2 damage for 4 mana, and it's a 1-of in their deck because it's a legendary. So it's not like it's a power spike card that's crazy or anything. But still, some really interesting implications, and I don't know that any deck would necessarily feel the need to run this over something like Frost Nova, because that just works better in a lot of cases because it's cheaper and therefore easier to slot into turns. But nonetheless, a card like this, because of that flexibility, because of the interesting moments it creates, I think would be a pretty cool addition to the game. So moving on here to Warwick, Zaan's Wrath from Mr. Geddes, 6-mana 4/5 beast. Now, I don't know if this should technically be a beast. I think he's more like humanoid in nature, perhaps, but this is League of Legends, not World of Warcraft, so I'm willing to let that slide. But the battle card reads, choose a minion. It can't attack until this minion leaves the battlefield. So we've got this really cool scenario where you've got a pseudo-permanent freeze as long as Warwick is in play. And I think that, again, creates some cool moments and stories in Hearthstone where you can really change how your opponent navigates a turn. Like if you have a really big crazy thing that they need to deal with, but instead they can't attack into a trade because of a card like Warwick, they got to kill Warwick first. Maybe that means your other thing survives. I don't know exactly what that looked like. Maybe you got like a Malagos or some really high value threat and you're trying to preserve it from board damage thanks to Warwick. That seems like a pretty convoluted scenario, but it comes to mind. Alternatively, I think this card's pretty cool as like a tech card of sorts where imagine those scenarios we've had in Hearthstone in the past where cards like Bittertide Hydra or Fell Reaver were played, and those big 5-mana 8/8s, your opponent would kind of go all in and they had these huge downsides, right? a card like Warwick could lock those out, and then you could just burn your opponent's entire deck in the case of Fel Reaver, for instance. So I don't know exactly how this would be used, and to be frank, I don't even know that this would be played in competitive standard Hearthstone today. I don't know if it's that strong because it's kind of worse than just like a sap or a removal card in a lot of ways, right? Think about like the Black Knight, for instance. It just kills taunts, right? Same kind of stat line and stuff. This just kind of locks down any given minion for maybe a turn or two. But nonetheless, as a tech card of sorts, I think this is a really nifty effect that does force your opponent to make some decisions, kind of shift their game plan around it a little bit. So yeah, maybe I'd make this 5 mana, maybe I'd bump up the stat line a little bit, but I still think there are decks and scenarios and metas where a card like this would become pretty intriguing. So moving on to Neeko the Chameleon from Weird Grim, a 4-mana 2/2 that reads, at the end of your turn, become a copy of a random friendly minion with Death Rattle Summon Neeko. So just to be clear, the wording here maybe could be tightened up a little bit, but the idea is that text line, Death Rattle Summon Neeko, will be added to the minion that Neeko transforms into. She will not transform only into minions with that text line already applied. So essentially what happens is here you have this chain of Neekos that can keep going on, right? So she becomes, I don't know, just say a Flame Imp, right, that has now Death Rattle Summon Neeko. So she becomes a 3/2, and as soon as that 3/2 dies, a 2/2 comes back, right? And then that 2/2, at the end of the turn, if it survives, will turn into another minion that summons a 2/2. And if your opponent can't resolve both halves of the Neeko, they're just going to have this 2/2 that keeps coming back. And they just either have to silence it or just kill both halves because it's at the end of the turn. So if they can deal with the 2/2 Neeko, then it's fine. But because she transforms into copies of minions, this can be pretty powerful, right? Like think about, I don't know, a Cairn Bloodhoof, for instance, right? A 6-mana play that you can play alongside your Neeko. She becomes a Cairn that now summons 2 things when it dies. And your opponent has this big bundle of stuff to deal with. And if you can control what she turns into, that's a pretty powerful play, kind of like a Faceless Manipulator with a little bit more upside, and that can in fact chain into even more future Faceless Manipulators. So I think this is a really neat design, puts a lot of impetus on your opponent to deal with these sorts of things. It's not terribly hard to do necessarily, they just kind of have to do it, and I think that's pretty cool for a card like this. Also, just shenanigans could be afoot, and as a chameleon-like character, it's obviously pretty fitting for her too. Moving on to Gnar, the Missing Link from Tingus, 5-mana 4/4 beast for Druid. Reads, after this minion deals 8 damage, transform it into Mega Gnar. Mega Gnar is a 5-mana 8/8 that reads, at the end of your turn, deal 5 damage to a random enemy. So this is kind of like a reverse Jan'alai almost. You know, Jan'alai the Dragonhawk is a 4/4 that summons an 8/8, and you have to do damage to do it. So I can see where the inspiration for this card came from, but it certainly operates a little differently because it's first off a cheaper minion, and it's a transform effect instead of a summon effect. And Mega Gnar arguably, in some ways, better than Ragnaros because he can attack, unlike Ragnaros. In other ways, worse because it only deals 5 damage. But nonetheless, still I think a unique design because it captures Gnar's transformation. He turns from this cute little dude into this crazy big scary dude. I might have made Gnar even a little smaller, but then you'd had to have changed the numbers as well, so that's fine. And what we're looking at here is an effect that I think is kind of hard to get off at a base level, right? Like playing a 5-mana 4/4 that doesn't have rush or anything, just kind of sits on the board. It's going to be hard for a minion like that to deal 8 damage. You have to basically trade into a couple things while keeping it alive, and that's sort of tough. But I do think Druid has some beast synergy support cards that could work really well with like a one of Gnar. So for instance, we already talked about this card weirdly enough, but Predatory Instincts. You draw Gnar out of your deck because maybe he's your only beast and you double his health. So now he's a 4/8 for 5 mana, right? Which is much stickier, much more likely to achieve the 8 damage condition. Then you could play a card like Stampeding Roar to give your Gnar rush. And then it's like, oh my gosh, wow, that makes a lot of sense. And as we know, Druid has some attack buff stuff as well. They could actually give this minion extra extra attack to satisfy the condition immediately. Now, that's a little bit risky because you might have a minion that's better than an 8/8 and you may not want to transform it, but that's still kind of cool, some decision points there. So I do think Druid has ways to support this. Now, is the payoff good enough for that? Like a 3-card combo that takes a ton of mana and you just get a Mega Gnar? I don't know if it's good enough, but I think it's still pretty fun. And if it's one of those things where your whole deck's not built around it, but it's just a piece of it, and it kind of fits in, and you just hope for your Gnar to go off, that's pretty neat. I think that would be really, really cool as a strong 5-mana option. Getting a Mega Gnar for 5 mana would be amazing, right? Like, that's a fantastic minion. You just got to put in a little work to get there. So maybe I tweak some numbers here and there on the Gnar, but I really do like this idea of the transformation and requiring you to build up some time to do it, or put some work in to get there and get this pretty big reward at the end of the day. So I think Ting has captured that pretty well. So moving on here to Thresh from Dreamzig, 4 mana, 1/6 for Warlock. Whenever a minion dies, add a copy of it into your deck. So this reminds me a little bit of like Spirit of the Dead for Priest that would put, cheap copies of minions into your deck. But Thresh has some stats, first off, which is cool. Plus, it's any minion, so you can actually do this with enemy minions as well, not just friendly minions. So if your opponent has some really cool, crazy cards, you could remove those and get a copy of them, which is cool to both prevent fatigue, but also just give you lots of value, or cards that you otherwise might not have access to, which could make this an interesting, almost pseudo-tech card in some metas, where it's like, I can't run this class card or this minion, but man, if I could take my opponents, I could do some crazy stuff. So I like that this is a value generator, a way for Warlock to shift perhaps from like an early aggressive style of play into something that could play them towards fatigue, because Warlock's drawing through their cards so fast, sometimes they don't have the luxury of going that late. So even if they're just trading in their own small stuff, adding extra depth to their deck could be nice. Now, we know it's risky to add bad minions to your deck. We always saw that with cards like Psychic Scream, so you're probably not looking to trade in 1/1 imps and stuff. Those aren't the sorts of things you want to be drawing, but mid to late game minions could be pretty great for Thresh. Now, admittedly, right, this is not the easiest play to achieve. Thresh is 4 mana, so to set up a scenario where you're killing multiple things, trading in a full board might not work out nicely. But if the stars do align and your opponent has 3 or 4 minions, you have 3 or 4 minions, and you could trade equal into those, Thresh is going to create tons of value. It's slow value, but it's value, and that's an interesting card. Would this be competitively viable? I don't really know. I don't think so at the moment, but it still is a cool scenario and a great way to play differently for Warlock. And since Warlock likes killing their own stuff, it does feel like a thematic fit for the class as well. So moving on here to Fizz, the title trickster from Mike is a Brobot. Mike is a Brobot. 4 mana, 2/3 Murloc with Rush, and this minion can only take 1 damage at a time. So we have a little bit of a different style of Murloc here. Now, obviously, Fizz is not technically a Murloc in the League of Legends universe, but hey, I think it's a good fit. He sure looks like one. So what's happening with this minion, right, is that it shifts Murlocs into a little bit more of a mid-game defensive style of play, where a minion like this is great at going, say, like 2 for 1 against small aggressive boards from your opponent. So it can take a trade, say, into like a 3/2 and survive, whereas normally it would have died in that scenario, which means it gets to go 2 for 1 instead of 1 for 1. And then with Murlocs in particular, and the ability to buff cards both from a health standpoint and damage standpoint, Fizz gets really intriguing. If you play this into a board that already has a Murloc War Leader, suddenly he's taking much better trades while still reducing his damage by a ton and becoming this sticky, annoying thing to deal with. It's particularly resilient against AoE boards, which Murlocs are in some cases very susceptible to. So it allows you to change the way you play a little bit. And I think Murloc Shaman would like that. It's a deck that already plays more towards the mid-range with some late-game stuff like Shudderwalk and Hagatha. It's not strictly an all-in aggro deck. Fizz supports that plan really nicely. It'd be the cool thing to get off of certainly your underbelly anglers. You'd be fine getting some bigger, more threatening Murlocs, although this isn't technically bigger in a lot of ways. It still is more influential to the board, so it kind of plays like it's bigger, or at the very least a higher mana cost. So I think this card would be a neat addition. I don't know if the balance is exactly right. I feel like you could tweak a few numbers here and it might feel even better in a lot of ways. I'll let you guys solve that, but I do like the idea here of a stickier, more resilient Murloc that supports a more mid-game shift for Shaman. And then finally here, one last card, Ivern, the Green Father from Faroon, a 5 mana 4/9 for Druid that reads, cannot attack, but at the end of your turn, summon a 2/2 Treant. So a very intriguing like token druid card here that doesn't play like we normally see token druid, which is all about getting the minions out as quickly as possible. This one shifts it where if your opponent doesn't deal with this really excessively large minion, then you are going to just keep generating 2/2 tokens that will probably eventually overwhelm them. So you force your opponent to make a play that is probably suboptimal. Because if you think about it, right, a 2/2 Treant is almost a 2 mana value in a token druid deck, which really means this 4/9 is kind of like 3 mana, because you're going to get that 2/2 no matter what when you play an Ivern, because it's at the end of your turn. So you're getting a 4/9 and a 2/2 immediately after playing this thing. So your opponent is spending a lot of mana to resolve a 4/9 in most cases, where they have to trade stuff in, use some sort of single target removal. So they've got some friction there. Like, do I spend all my time dealing with this thing, or do I just let it go for a few turns, right? Because if it goes for a few turns, it's generating ridiculous amounts of value. And I really like that scenario where I got to choose what I want to deal with here. Do I just keep dealing with a 2/2 every turn, or do I finally commit to killing the Ivern, or wait till I say have like a brawl, for instance, that's going to wipe it away anyway? There's all kinds of decision points being made, but a card that still supports a Treant build of Druid, perhaps. Maybe it even moves it more towards a mid to late game sort of thing, but shifts the way we think about Token Druid in a little bit of a way, but also just super fitting for the character and the class. And there you go, guys. That wraps it up for this custom card review. Some pretty cool stuff. A lot of great cards I left off to. I think you guys do a lot better when you have characters and storylines to base designs off of, as opposed to just like creating an idea out of thin air. So ones like this one go a long way towards seeing some great cards. Now, on that note, for our next review, it's going to be about tech cards. And I don't mean mechs, I mean tech cards. And a tech card is a card that is used to specifically counter a specific thing in the meta, right? So, for instance, Big Game Hunter is a tech card against giant 7 attack minions, right? And we've seen other instances of tech cards as well that are put into the game just to answer a specific thing. So I want you to think about what's the most annoying to you in Hearthstone right now. Is it like hero cards, for instance? If a hero card's really bothering you, you could make a tech card that answers hero cards. Maybe it says like, your opponent's hero cards are moved to the bottom of their deck. Something like that, right? And maybe I just stole a good idea. I'm sorry, but it doesn't have to be hero cards. It can be anything that bugs you. Whatever you think the game needs an answer to, design me a card that is fair, is a way to answer that, but still powerful as well. And that'll be the topic for next time. Get the full details in the description below. But until then, please share your thoughts on these cards. Thanks so much for watching, and until next time, game on.